Well, this part it's going to be in English because our first is from Notre Dame. So first of all, I want to thank Dr. Clemens Sedmak. Can you hear us? Thanks.
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Clemens. So let me introduce Dr. Clemens Sedmak. Clemens Sedmak is a current professor at Notre Dame Institute for Social Concerns. Before coming to Notre Dame, Sedmak was the FFP Maurice Professor for Moral Theology and Social Theology at King's College in London. He has held multiple positions at the University of Salzburg, serving as director of the Center for Ethics and Poverty Research and chair for epistemology and philosophy of religion. Sedmak also was president of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Social Ethics in Salzburg. Sedmak holds doctoral degrees in philosophy, theology, and social theory. Born in Austria, he has studied at the University of Innsbruck, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, New York, and the University of Linz. He has been a visiting professor of the Jomo Kenyatta University in Nairobi, the Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines, the University of Jena, Germany, the Vienna Business University, and the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City. And he also collaborated several times in UPAEP, in the Instituto Promotor del Bien Común, with Professor Matthias Level. So, Clemens, thank you very much for being with us. Let's talk.
Thank you so much. Good morning to UPAEP. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Very good. So I will try to speak slowly for my own sake, because English is not my first language, and for your sake. I was told to speak until 1 o'clock my time, so this is almost an hour. I hope that you can bear with me for 1 full hour. What I would like to do is think about the violation of human dignity. When is human dignity violated? What does it mean to violate a person's dignity? And I would like to start with an example. Let me try to share my screen here. I don't have many slides, but this is one slide I would have. So the example is this one. Let me minimize that. A Swedish woman, in describing her experience raising her son Fred, who was diagnosed with autism, recounts a particular scene. Once, my mother had looked after Fred for a night, and I came to the farm to pick him up. She had tied one end of a long rope around his tummy and the other end round the trunk of a big tree. She had a lot to do, hanging laundry, and couldn't stop doing all the chores around the place. The first thing I saw was my little 4-year-old, my baby, a captive, tied down with a rope. He was pulling at the rope that restrained him. I saw red. I was used to not showing my anger and quietly went over to the tree and turned him loose. Her mother inquired whether she was upset. Yes, I damn well am, I said indignantly. Do you have any idea how awful it seems, his being tied up like that? And the mother's reaction? Yes, she answered quietly, but it was the only way for me to do anything but watch over him, and I don't honestly think it harmed him one little bit. Which brings me to the question, has Fred's dignity been violated? When you think about this question, has Fred's dignity been violated, you would probably think about a number of factors. A number of factors. One factor would probably be the context. One factor will probably be the point of view. When we look at this situation, we speak from a particular perspective. I remember an African student assessing this situation and saying only animals are tied to a tree with a rope. Another African student added to that, only thieves are tied up like that. An American student was reminded of slavery by the image of Fred tied up. So it all depends on the history of our interactions with situations like these that will shape our point of view, that will constitute our moral history with a particular question or topic. Secondly, there's the question of intentionality. Is it relevant to think about what was the grandmother's intention in this particular situation? It may be safe to assume that the grandmother's intention was not to violate Fred's dignity, but rather to make sure that he was safe. Which also brings us to the question of the relationship. What is the relationship between the stakeholders, the players and agents in this situation? We can assume that the grandmother has basically a special relationship with her grandson, a benevolent relationship committed to the well-being of her grandson. This special relationship leads us to the next aspect, the special status of Fred. This story talks about Fred as being diagnosed with autism. So he has a special status. He's 4 years old. That already makes him vulnerable. And he's diagnosed with autism, which makes him even more vulnerable. In situations like these, when we think about has a person's dignity been violated, we would like to consider the special relationships as well as the special status of people involved. We could also ask, what was Fred's subjective experience? What was it like for him to be tied to a tree? We can assume, since he was pulling at the rope that restrained him, that he did not like what was happening. Which brings me to a next question, the so-called reference cases. Aren't there many situations where we restrict the freedom of movement of children? We can think of strollers. We can think of playpens. We can think of car seats. We can think of seats in an airplane. There are many situations where we intentionally restrict the freedom of movement of children and even our own freedom to move. These are important aspects to think about the reference cases as well. Another important aspect would be alternatives and reasons for action. Would there have been alternatives for the grandmother? Could she have used other options rather than tying her grandson to a tree? That's a relevant consideration when we think of human dignity violations. What would be alternatives? Are there options? Okay. So when we think about this very simple question, has Fred's dignity been violated? We could think of issues such as point of view and positionality, intentions and intentionality, relationship of the actors, status of the potential victim and distribution of power, subjective experience, alternatives, and reasons or justification for the course of action. We could also think about the question of harm. Has Fred been harmed by the treatment? Has he been damaged? If not, and this is the grandmother's opinion, you have less of a case to say that Fred's dignity was violated. We also need to look at the particular context and the specific circumstances. What are relevant circumstances? Is it relevant that Fred's grandmother was a farmer and had to take care of a farm. Is that a relevant circumstance? Most people would probably say yes. And then we have to think about the standards. We have to think about the standards, what can be realistically expected in our efforts to protect and respect people's dignity. There's one interesting term in ethics, and the term is hysteria ethics or hysterical ethics. The term means that we create major ethical challenges out of little things, or that every little aspect becomes a huge moral challenge. And here we have to remind ourselves what are realistic standards. I will give you another aspect of this story. And keep in mind, the question here is, what are realistic standards? The next summer, Maud, Fred's mother, and her husband went out for a picnic on Midsummer's Eve. The parents took turns to save the food, the garbage, the stereo, the china from their son Fred, who would destroy everything he would get hold of. Maud recounts, I had packed everything with love and care, including napkins, a small Swedish flag, and a tablecloth. All of no use. Why did I even try to make things nice and keep up a semblance of a festive mood? A dark rage came over me again. Fuck. He got hold of an egg and smashed it in his hand, threw himself over the rest of the food to find something else to smash. I helped him, threw an egg at the tree, it smashed. I didn't give a damn. His father said calmly, I've got a 30-foot rope in the car. Get it, I said. And obviously, it is to her credit that she mentions ever so honestly the challenges she faced. Has Fred's dignity been violated? We looked at certain aspects such as positionality, intentionality, special relationship, special status, circumstances, alternatives, and justification of action. But we also need to think about what are realistic standards, where is the bar that we can properly respect in our everyday lives. So this is my first opening point and example. I spent 10 minutes on that because it is a very important and interesting example. And now I would like to say something about the lofty concept of human dignity, followed by the ordinary use of the term, and then moving to reference points and learning from judges. So my next points would be the lofty concept of human dignity, ordinary language and the use of the term, reference points, and then learning from judges. So the lofty concept of human dignity. Countless people use the concept of dignity in countless contexts. It is a lofty term. It is solemn and weighty, even cumbersome, and sometimes people call human dignity a conversation stopper. Conversation stopper means you don't quite know what to say when you are confronted with the accusation you have violated my dignity. There is a taboo setting function with human dignity. Some people worry about this taboo setting function, thinking that the concept is used instead of rational arguments. The concept they think is celebrating. It's too lofty, it's too solemn. So how can we bring it down to earth? The concept, as you know, is diffuse and controversial. It is quite upsetting that people who contradict each other can both evoke the concept of human dignity. Just think of euthanasia or doctor-assisted suicide. Those who are against doctor-assisted suicide could use human dignity as an important argument. Those in favor of assisted suicide could also use human dignity and speak about, for example, dying with dignity. So the lofty concept of human dignity is controversial, it is complex, and we don't really know how to solve differences in our understanding of the term. One important question here would be, which situations are relevant to introduce the term? Which situations are relevant to introduce the term? I'm from Austria, so for me, given the Nazi past of Austria, there are many situations I could think of to show this is where human dignity has been violated. This is a situation where human dignity has been trampled upon. But it's a very important question. Which situations would you use to introduce the term? So the concept of human dignity is lofty, it is controversial, and I would say it has two main functions. It has a positive function and it has a negative function. The positive function is the constructive one, helping us to ask the question, what does human dignity mean and how can we respect human dignity? The negative function is the defensive function. It makes us ask the question, when is human dignity violated and what should we do as a minimum to protect human dignity? So one good question to ask, and I'm coming to my next section now, is how is human dignity being used by ordinary users? Not by philosophers, not by lawyers and judges, but by people in their everyday lives. So ordinary language and the use of the term. I once designed a research project with students who conducted about 150 interviews with peers in Austria. And the question was, what is the understanding of human dignity? So I have about 150 interviews where students interviewed other students to understand what do they think about human dignity. And it's really interesting to look at the way these ordinary users of language, would use when talking about dignity. Dignity in these interviews has been associated with the right to respectful existence, the right to live in the world, the recognition that every person has inestimable value, the right to lead a valuable life. Everyone has their place in society. Human dignity means that people are accommodated in their needs and preferences. Or another quotation, a life in dignity means being part of a society that promotes justice. Many students who were interviewed about human dignity underlined that human dignity is connected to self-determination and independence, to freedom and the right to make your own choices, to responsibility and the right to choose among options. Very few students worried about the term human dignity as an irrational or dangerous or stupid term. Very few did. Most of them really liked the idea of human dignity as an important concept. And then we asked them the question, is dignity the highest value? Is dignity the highest value? Because if dignity was the highest value, we should do whatever we can to reduce dignity violations. Is dignity the highest value? Students gave me two alternatives to dignity. One said dignity is important, but not the highest value. Health is the highest value. Health. And some of us may remember the dark times of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. There were many discussions about what are values, what are moral goods, and what are the highest moral goods and the highest moral values. And not infrequently, we heard health is the highest value. So we need to protect health. And I remember an interview by Wolfgang Schäuble, who was then, during the pandemic, the president of the German parliament, the Bundestag. And in this interview, he said, at least for us in Germany, we cannot accept health to be the highest value. If there is any absolute value in our German constitution, it is human dignity. So he made it very clear that, and you all know in Germany, the constitution has as its first sentence, human dignity is inviolable. So the Germans are reminded of, if there is an absolute highest good, it would be human dignity and not health. To be honest, I would underline that health is an important good. It is a meta good that allows me to reach other goods, but it cannot be a good in itself. I don't live in order to be healthy. I try to remain healthy in order to do other important things. But this question, what's the highest good? Is human dignity the highest good? Was discussed in the interviews. And as I said, there were two candidates that the students presented as the highest value. One was health and the other was freedom. A number of students said freedom is more important than dignity. Freedom is more important than dignity. And you would like to say, well, isn't there a connection between freedom and dignity? But we do understand where the students are coming from. And in contemporary philosophy, freedom is such an important value. Just think of the capability approach by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. The ordinary language users, the students whom we interviewed about human dignity, also emphasized the necessity of translating human dignity into everyday practices. Human dignity is relevant down to the details of our daily lives. One can show, one other student said, how the concept of human dignity can be anchored in everyday relationships. Respect for dignity is evident in small everyday actions. So there's this sense of human dignity is a lofty concept, but we have to bring it down to the ground and translate it into everyday practices. This is, as you know, what Eleanor Roosevelt famously said. She was the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights back in the late 1940s. And Eleanor Roosevelt also said human rights begin in the everyday lives, in our family homes, in our classrooms, in our parks. So there's this sense of, yes, especially because human dignity is a lofty concept, we need to embed it in everyday practices. I also asked the students, can you give me specific examples of dignity violations? And many students, independently from each other, mentioned spitting, to spit on a person. This is interesting. If someone is spat on, they are not harmed in a physical sense. Spitting does not cause bodily injury. Nevertheless, it is a substantial example of an infringement of dignity because a person is treated as if the person was a piece of grass in the meadow on which you can spit, or as if she was an object that has no feelings. So there is a pretty well-rooted sense of what human dignity is when you ask ordinary users of our language. When we ask them, what is dignity? When is human dignity violated? What does it mean to respect a person's dignity? So this is my third point, ordinary language and the use of the term. Now I would like to move to reference cases before we learn from judges. And the reference cases would be, let me try to get back to my screen share here. The reference cases would be positive and negative. So positive reference cases would be, my dear colleague Paul Perrin did a literature review, a global literature review on what do people need in order to feel that their dignity is respected. And this survey came up with 4 main points. The dignity of a person is respected if the person feels that she's accepted in her identity. So acceptance of identity is the first point in respecting a person's dignity. the embracing of one's and others' authentic selves without fear of negative consequence. This is, of course, especially important for people whose identity may be more controversial. Members of the LGBTQ community, transgender persons could come to mind. Secondly, inclusion. A person feels that her dignity is respected if the person is included in decision-making processes, if she can participate in society. And this is especially important for people who may have a migration background, who are discriminated against on the basis of age or their disability or their ethnicity. So the sense of inclusion. Thirdly, dignity is respected if people are recognized as persons and acknowledged as right bearers. So acknowledgement or recognition as a third dimension. You are respected as a source of entitlements that have to be protected. And fourthly, independence, autonomy, and agency. People feel respected in their dignity if they have independent decision-making powers, if they can exercise their agency and autonomy. So this would be a positive reference point for human dignity. Acceptance of identity, inclusion, acknowledgement, and independence. Irina Mosley and Carrie Holloway did research among refugees and asked them in 6 different countries, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Colombia, Lebanon, the Philippines, and South Sudan. They asked them whether and how they feel that their dignity has been upheld in displacement, in their situation as refugees. The 2 most important aspects that emerged were respect and self-reliance. Respect and self-reliance. People want to be acknowledged, recognized, and they also want to be seen as autonomous, as agents who can make their own decisions. So these would be positive ways to think about human dignity. Negative reference points, I would like to mention 3. The minimum that we have to honor in order to not to violate a person's dignity is, I have the 3 pillars here: non-infantilization, non-instrumentalization, and non-humiliation. So you violate a person's dignity if you infantilize the person. If you treat a person as if she was not capable of making decisions and of exercising agency. And this is not uncommon. This is not uncommon that we infantilize people we work with. I was involved in a project on the humanitarian corridor in Italy, where 500 African refugees were brought to Italy, and many of them complained about their infantilization. They were given pocket money, and that's how it was called. They were not consulted about their choices in accommodation or food. They felt like children. And in this case, it was even more severe because many of the children of these adults had an easier time learning Italian and then acted as translators for their parents, who felt, because of their linguistic exclusion, even more infantilized. So it's quite often the case that we infantilize people we work with. There's also a tendency to infantilize the elderly. There was a study done by Nina Cohn about infantilization of the elderly in certain centers. The way caregivers talk about dementia patients, the activities, the environment they create. So this is my number 1 pillar. The minimum of respecting a person's dignity would be not to infantilize the person. The second pillar would be not to instrumentalize the person. A person's dignity is violated if the person is reduced to a means to an end, is reduced to an instrument. Instrumentalizing a person means treating a person as a means to an end. And we all know Immanuel Kant's warning, this is not the way to treat a human person. And this happens quite often, that we instrumentalize other people. I give an example. A young development worker worked with a particular NGO and complained that the NGO viewed their students as products that could have positive results that would increase the funding of the NGO. So the NGO focused on the students they worked with as basically sources for more donations and instrumentalized their work for these purposes. We all remember, or most of us may remember, the migration politics of Lukashenko from the Belarusian regime in 2021, when Belarus began actively attracting migrants from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and other countries, before encouraging and even forcing them to cross the borders into the European Union, which put a lot of pressure on Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. And the point here is Lukashenko instrumentalized the refugees, highly vulnerable people, for his political gain. So this happens quite often. Obviously, severe forms of instrumentalization happen through exploitation, human trafficking, sexual exploitation. So it is obvious that this really happens. Thirdly, the minimum of respecting human dignity is non-humiliation. Humiliating a person means debasing a human person, challenging the public persona and status of the person, calling into question the right of a person to be respected, treating her as not fully human. In basically every single course I teach here in Notre Dame, I ask the students, do you see entry points for humiliation on campus? Whether this would be dining hall workers, whether this would be cleaning staff, whether this would be fellow students. Do you see entry points for humiliation? It is a very important question to ask. I was once involved in a research project on human dignity in hospitals. And we asked, it was in Germany, we asked patients, do you see entry points for humiliation in the hospital, you as patients? And they mentioned three things. They mentioned lack of privacy. If you have a hospital room with several beds, you can overhear the conversation that's going on at the neighbor bed. Your conversation will be overheard. And they also mentioned the bathroom. If you have, let's say, a hospital room with 6 beds, and there's a bathroom for all of them that's not soundproof. They said it's quite humiliating that you relieve yourself and everybody in the room can overhear that. So number one, entry point for humiliation in the hospital, lack of privacy. Secondly, they mentioned bodily shame. They mentioned nakedness. How far do I have to undress? How long? In front of whom? For which reason? And they mentioned some embarrassing situations of being stark naked in front of strangers, which can be a deeply humiliating experience if there are generational or religious aspects as well. The third aspect I mentioned was objectification. The patient said, when you think of the doctor's rounds, the doctors are really interested only in the part of the body that is the reason why you're in the hospital, and they tend to forget that there's a person with a soul and a whole, social aura around her. And it's important to ask this question, where are entry points for humiliation in a given context? In this hospital, they mentioned privacy, they mentioned bodily shame, they mentioned objectification, and it's good to be aware of that. You cannot probably change the doctor's rounds, but you can be probably more sensitive in terms of how you want to do those doctor's rounds. Maybe skip that. In an exercise mapping entry points for humiliation in an institutional setting, we found those 3 main categories. The vulnerable body. When are you stripped naked and exposed? When are you restrained and restricted? And when are you made to lose control over your body? For example, when you cannot relieve yourself and there is no bathroom available. The vulnerable status. The entry points for humiliation increase if there are strict hierarchies, if there's a lack of recognition, and if there is an unnecessary lack of freedoms. And finally, the vulnerable institutions that create moral stress can be experiences of humiliation. An institution creates moral stress if people are forced to work in a way that they have to violate their own moral standards. If there is a hospital that's understaffed, it creates moral stress. The vulnerable institution, sometimes the incentive structure can be humiliating. For example, if you have to fail 25% of a class, and if that's the prescription you have to follow, the incentive structure is prone to leading to humiliation. And finally, institutions themselves can be morally vulnerable because especially if they're under-resourced, they cannot control all aspects of their strategies to respect a person's dignity. So in a nutshell, this was my point 4 reference points, positive reference points to think about human dignity with those 4 findings from Paul Perrin: acceptance of identity, social inclusion, recognition, and autonomy. And the 3 negative ways to approach human dignity, namely non-infantilization, non-instrumentalization, and non-humiliation. Probably the last one, non-humiliation, is the most tangible one, which brings me to my point number 5. Let me just summarize. I'm at minute 33, so a little less than half an hour left. I started with an example of Maud Deckmore about her 4-year-old son who was tied to a tree by his grandmother. And the question was Fred's dignity violated? And we looked at issues such as positionality, intentionality, quality of relationship, special status of the victim, alternatives and options, and the justification of the course of action. We also looked into realistic standards, and you remember the story continued with Maud and her husband running out of patience with their 4-year-old son when they tried to have a lovely picnic in the park. My second point was how is human dignity a challenging concept? It's challenging because it's a lofty concept. It's a controversial concept because it can be invoked by people who deeply disagree with each other. It is sometimes called a conversation stopper, where you don't know what to say when you have been accused of violating a person's dignity. That is why some philosophers say human dignity is not a necessary concept. As long as you have a concept of autonomy, we don't need dignity. I would disagree with that, because especially if we deal with highly vulnerable people whose autonomy is restricted because they suffer from dementia or because they are in a coma, the concept of human dignity can do some work that the concept of autonomy cannot. Then we looked at ordinary language, and I told you about this project with 150 interviews with students about human dignity. They clearly connected dignity with a right to live in society, the right to have a place in the social world, the right to autonomy. They also thought about is dignity the highest good? They thought about 2 alternatives, namely freedom and health. And they talked about the importance of translating dignity into everyday practices. Then I moved to my reference points, the positive reference points where Paul Perrin has these findings, which I mentioned, and the 3 negative ones. The minimum of respecting dignity of a person means you do not infantilize the person, you do not instrumentalize the person, and you do not humiliate the person. Which brings me to my point number 5. My point number 5 is the following. I'm really interested in the European Court of Human Rights. So I just want to show you a picture. If I have it here, there is a picture. So this is the European Court of Human Rights. Sorry about this. Here we are. This is the European Court of Human Rights. And as you may know, the European Court of Human Rights has to decide about cases that violate the European Charter of Human Rights. And this is the famous Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 3. It's called Prohibition of Torture, and it says, no one shall be subjected to torture or to inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. The European Convention on Human Rights, this is the binding reference point for the judges, has an Article 3, which is sometimes called the Dignity Article, in the dignity article says, no one shall be subjected to torture or to inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Now, if you look at the text, it is a little unfortunate that there are three very different categories put together in one short paragraph. There's a difference between torture and degrading treatment. There's the question, what's the difference between inhuman or degrading treatment? So there are many questions, but unlike philosophers, judges have to make a decision. We philosophers can have endless discussions without arriving at a conclusion. The judges have to decide, was the dignity of a particular person in a particular case violated, yes or no? Famous examples would be, if you have a metal cage in a courtroom and the criminal that is whose case is discussed is displayed in this metal cage in the courtroom, is this a violation of the criminal's dignity, yes or no? And there are many decisions, and of course they refer mainly to East European countries, especially Russia, that would say, yes, it is degrading for a person to be put on display in a metal cage. So I have this research project I'm deeply interested in. What can we philosophers learn from Article 3 decisions of the European Court of Human Rights? What can we philosophers learn from the judges? As you know, the European Court of Human Rights, and here it is again in Strasbourg, has signatory states of the convention, and there are currently 46. It used to be 47. Russia has left. And each signatory state appoints one judge. One judge. The term of office is 9 years. And the court has two levels. A first instance, a so-called chamber with 7 judges. And a second and last instance, the so-called grand chamber with 17 judges. The judges have the option of submitting concurring or dissenting opinions, which for me as a philosopher is really fascinating. If judges do not agree on something and you have dissenting opinions, I find this fascinating because the judges are equally trained. They are very well-qualified lawyers, and they are accountable to the same normative document, the European Convention on Human Rights. They basically have to deal with that. And their decisions have to be informed by the previous history of decisions and judgments by the European Court. So they're basically sitting in the same boat, but they're not always arriving at the same conclusion. And I give you a famous example, Jalot versus Germany. Jalot versus Germany. In this case, Jalot versus Germany, you had a West African man who was suspected of drug trafficking and was under police surveillance. During a suspicious interaction, Mr. Jalot was arrested and he was observed swallowing something. Okay? He was arrested in a suspicious interaction, and the police officers who arrested him observed that he swallowed something. No drugs were found on him. Mr. Jalot refused to cooperate, so he was restrained by 4 police officers while a doctor administered an emetic via a tube. An emetic is, as you know, a medicine that makes a person vomit. The emetic caused him to vomit a capsule containing cocaine. So there was a little box of cocaine that he had swallowed. Mr. Jalot claimed that he had been subjected to inhuman and degrading treatment because he had been forcibly administered an emetic, which constituted a serious interference with his physical integrity and a serious threat to his health. The manner in which he was forced to undergo a life-threatening medical procedure was violent, painful, and humiliating. He was humiliated to such an extent that he had to vomit in front of several police officers. As he was in police custody, he was in a particularly vulnerable position. Okay, so this is the case of Mr. Jalot. And as you also know, the way it works is you try to exhaust the national courts. And if you are not satisfied with the way you have been treated, in this case in Germany, you can go up to the European Court of Human Rights. And this is what the lawyers of Mr. Jalot did. So Mr. Jalot said his dignity was violated in this interaction. The German government was obviously not of the opinion that his dignity was violated. They said the forced administration of emetics involves only negligible health risks. There was a real and immediate danger for Mr. Jalot because the capsule in his stomach could have burst and poisoned the applicant. So the German government said it was much more dangerous to do nothing than to have him regurgitate the capsule, because if the capsule burst open in his stomach, it would have poisoned the applicant from within. Waiting for the drug to be excreted naturally would not have been an equally effective method of investigation and would have been probably even more humiliating. Because if you remember the Fred example, one consideration is, are there good alternatives? And one alternative in the case of Jalot would have been to wait for nature to take its course and to just wait for the capsule to come out naturally. But of course, we also know what that means. It means that the applicant, Mr. Jalot, would have been under surveillance 24/7. Especially under surveillance when he was relieving himself. And this is clearly grossly humiliating. So the judges were confronted with this question: has the dignity of Mr. Jalot been violated, yes or no? And again, we philosophers can have endless, immensely interesting discussions that do not lead to a conclusion. And we philosophers can always say it is complicated on the one hand, on the other hand. In the case of the judges of the European Court of Human Rights, they have to make a decision. So the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights ruled that violence bordering on brutality had been used against the applicant. They said the treatment must have caused him pain and fear. The psychological suffering of the applicant while waiting for the emetic to take effect must also be taken into account. During this time, he was restrained and observed by police officers and a doctor. Being forced to vomit under these conditions must have been humiliating for him. So the court did not share the German government's view that waiting for the drugs to break down naturally would have been equally humiliating. And now listen to this. The court found by 10 votes to 7 that there had been a violation of Article 3 and that the applicant had been treated in an inhuman and degrading manner. In other words, 10 judges against 7 judges ruled that the dignity of Mr. Jalot had been violated. 10 versus 7. And this is philosophically really interesting. Which are the criteria that were used to come to this non-unanimous judgment? Judge Supancic from Slovenia had a concurring separate opinion. And as I told you before, I'm really interested in those opinions, either concurring or dissenting. So one judge who voted with the majority of 10 judges who said, yes, Mr. Jalot's dignity was violated. In his separate opinion, he even said that Mr. Jalot did not only suffer inhuman and degrading treatment, it was torture sensu stricto. It was torture sensu stricto. So one judge said, yes, it was an Article 3 violation, but not only the slightly milder case of inhuman or degrading treatment. So you see my cursor here. Inhuman or degrading treatment. It was even torture. It was even torture, which is the strongest category. Judges Wildhaber and Keflisch issued a dissenting separate opinion that addressed the motives for the treatment and its proportionality. So they said It was risky. Drug trafficking is very dangerous, so the means the German government used were in proportion to the risks at stake. In another dissenting opinion, Judges Ress, Pellonpey, Bakker, and Schikuta argued that the position of the German government was supportable, namely that the alternative method of waiting for natural elimination would have been even more humiliating. So what you see here in this example is, even if you have equally trained judges who are equally committed to the same normative document, namely the European Convention on Human Rights, there is no guarantee that they will agree on a particular case. And this is where it becomes really interesting, because the European Court of Human Rights says you have to consider each and every aspect, relevant aspect and circumstance of the situation. Now, I will give you 3 more examples and then just have some tentative conclusions. One other example is this famous case, Wackenheim versus France from the 1990s. So this case was interesting insofar as it asked the question, whose decision is it to decide whether the dignity of a person was violated, yes or no. As you can see, Manuel Wackenheim is a short person, 1 meter 10 centimeters height, so he is what's sometimes called a little person. And these are the slides here to the left, you see my cursor. He made a living by being thrown around in a safety gear by people who paid for this experience. It is beyond me why anybody would pay to throw another human being around, but this is what happened. And then the French authorities said this must not happen any longer because it is against the dignity of Manuel Wackenheim. Okay? And the French authorities up to the Supreme Court upheld this decision. It is incompatible with human dignity to have a little person being thrown around by other people against money. And Manuel Wackenheim went all the way to the European Court of Human Rights and said the following. He said, look, I am already discriminated against on the labor market given my physical appearance. I have a niche in the labor market, which is what you can see here on the left side, being thrown around against money. If they take this away from me, I'm in an even more difficult situation and will be in an even more challenging situation to live a dignified life. I, Manuel Wackenheim, decide when and whether my dignity is violated or not. It should not be a court that decides on my behalf. That was a famous case, and the decision, by the way, of this European Court of Human Rights was quite clear. They said yes to the French authority against Manuel Wackenheim, and basically said the concept of human dignity is too important for the social and cultural world to be left to the interpretation of individuals. So this is a famous case. A second case that I would like to mention is the case Tyra versus United Kingdom. This was a case from 1978. It became quite important in the history of the European legislation. The story is the following. In 1972, a 15-year-old boy from the Scottish Isle of Man was sentenced to 3 strokes with a birch rod. So this is called birching. What happened was the 15-year-old brought alcohol into the school. He was observed by another student who reported that to a teacher. And then Tyra got really angry at this fellow student and beat him up. Okay. As a result, he was sentenced to birching. 3 strokes with a birch rod administered by police officers in the presence of a medical doctor and his father on the bare bottom. This is what happened, and then he went again all the way to the European Court of Human Rights and said, this is humiliating, this is a violation of my dignity, it is a violation of Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. This was 6 years later. That's always a problem in the European Court of Human Rights system. It takes years for any case to appear in front of the judges. And the decision was, with an overwhelming majority, yes, the dignity of Mr. Tyra was violated. It is a breach of Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights to have this kind of punishment. The case became famous because it used the term dynamic instrument. It said the European Convention on Human Rights is a dynamic instrument. Dynamic instrument means it has to be interpreted in the light of the signs of the times given the changing context. In other words, what was compatible with Article 3, let's say in the year 1972, is no longer compatible with Article 3 in the year 1978. So this was a famous case, Tyra versus United Kingdom, because it created this term, it is a dynamic instrument. What's also interesting about this case, Tyra versus United Kingdom, is the fact that one particular judge went against the majority and said in a dissenting opinion, I am not of the opinion that the dignity of Mr. Tyra had been violated. And this was, interestingly enough, the British representative. The representative of the United Kingdom, Maurice Fitzgerald, and he said, and that's so interesting, I grew up in this system. Birching was part of my tradition. We, in my time, did not see anything humiliating in that. It was rather a chivalresque challenge to take their strokes in good stride without shedding any tears. Where you also see the positionality of the judge comes into play when thinking about assessing human dignity violations. My last example would be Bouygues versus Belgium. And obviously there are hundreds, thousands of examples, but I'm reaching minute 54. So in my remaining 5 minutes, I will just give you one last case and a few conclusions. My last example from the European Court of Human Rights would be Bouygues versus Belgium. Bouygues versus Belgium. What happened was the following. Bouygues was a 17-year-old adolescent who had left his key in the apartment in their multi-story building, so locked himself out and was waiting in front of the building for family members to come back home so that he could go back into his apartment. Police officers observed him hanging around in front of the apartment, asked him to identify himself, which he could not since he didn't have an ID on him, so they took him to the police station to establish his identity. In the police station, he was really, really provocative and rude, did not collaborate and provoked the police officers, so much so that one police officer hit him once in the face and slapped him with the hand. And here again, it went all the way up to the European Court of Human Rights. Was the dignity of Mr. Bouygues violated, yes or no? Interestingly enough, in the chamber, that's the first level of the court, the majority said no. It is compatible with Article 3. In the grand chamber, these are the 17 judges in the last instance, the majority was very clear. This was a violation of Mr. Bouygues' dignity. And there was one dissenting opinion which I find so interesting, and the dissenting opinion said, of course, hitting anybody in a police station is simply wrong. It is simply wrong. But there is a difference between torture and a police officer who felt provoked. And we should not trivialize the discourse on violating a person's dignity. So if you look carefully at all these arguments, they will always talk about the threshold of severity. Has the threshold of severity been violated, and has the case been severe enough to count as an Article 3 violation? This is my last point. What can we learn from European Court of Human Rights or from judges? So let me summarize. I started with an example, the example of red. I talked about the lofty concept of human dignity. Had some examples from ordinary language users. Had a positive reference point. You remember the 4 pillars from Paul Perrin, and 3 negative reference points: non-infantilization, non-instrumentalization, and non-humiliation. And then gave you some examples and lessons from the European Court of Human Rights. We looked at Tyra versus UK, Bouygues versus Belgium, Jalot versus Germany, Tyra versus UK as examples. A few conclusions. It is always good to ask the question, what are best examples, and by best I don't mean great, but most illustrating examples of dignity violations. When you look at the legislation of the European Court of Human Rights, it's mostly at the intersection of institutions and the human body. Most examples of dignity violations in the European Court are violations in prisons, in courtrooms, in schools, in military compounds, in hospitals, in psychiatric clinics, and most of them involve the human body. So that's one lesson. We have to be particularly sensitive to the intersection of institutions and the human body. Secondly, general conclusion is we really have to take each and every aspect of a circumstance into account. For example, handcuffing. There are situations when handcuffing a person is well justified and even necessary to prevent bigger evil from happening. But the same handcuffing can be a humiliation and a dignity violation in other instances. Or strip searches, bodily searches, when a person has to be stripped. Again, there are situations when this can be justified, but the more intrusive a measure, the higher the risk for humility or humiliation and a dignity violation, the better it has to be justified. So coming back to my initial example, and I would be thrilled to understand where you stand, was Fred's dignity violated in the example that I showed? My personal opinion is no. This is not an institutional context. I do not see cruelty. There are many situations where we restrict the freedoms of small children. The grandmother had a basically benevolent relationship, did not intend to harm him. There was probably no long-term consequence in doing what she did. And we have to acknowledge that it was very difficult for Fred's mother to find a babysitter, and that's why she asked her own mother, Fred's grandmother. So my reading of the situation is, yes, of course, it's a good example that could be looked at as a candidate for a human dignity violation. Looking at all the circumstances together, I do not think that Fred's dignity has been violated, because I would also like to avoid, in the spirit of my last remark, a trivialization of the discourse on human dignity and its violation. So much to learn from the judges, so many more cases to be reported on, but now I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clemens. We have some time for questions. Sunny, Dr. Sir.
Thanks, Professor. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, yes.
Thank you very much. I have 3 questions. The first one is about the interview instruments you use in your research. And the question is if they are available to the public so that we can repeat the research here.
Yes, I'm collecting your 3 questions, if I may, and then I respond to them.
Good. The second one is a little bit, it's almost nitpicking, but wouldn't it be relevant to refer to non-infantilization as something as non-agency, since the term infantilize or infant, if you will, is in the same status as humiliation and instrumentalization, maybe but infants inside a pejorative frame of reference. And the third one is, well, you said something about this, but I would like you to say something else. What are your thoughts on the self-violation of dignity with consent, if that makes sense? And those are my 3 questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the first question about the interviews, the methodology was not very sophisticated. We had a list of 12 questions. We asked the students to conduct semi-structured interviews, record them and transcribe them, with the proper institutional review board permission. And the interviews are available. Sadly, they are all in German. But I'm happy to share what I have, because it's really interesting, as I said, and you could do the same, with your students. you can give them a list of questions, and I'm happy to share the questions with you if that helps. Just shoot me an email. And then the students would find fellow students. My project was not to have a representative sample. That was not the project. I just taught a course with 200 students who were enrolled in that course from all faculties and schools of our university back in Austria. And I asked them to have interviews with their peers. So I'm not saying this is a sophisticated methodology, but the results were really interesting. But I do not claim that this is representative of the Southern German Austrian students at the time, 2 years ago. The second question, the nitpicking question, of course you are right. If I said, let's just focus on non-humiliation, it will take care of the other two categories. Because humiliating a person also means reducing the person to an object, reducing the person to a mere means to an end. And the philosopher who taught me the most about this concept of humiliation is the Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit, and his famous book, The Decent Society, where he would say, to humiliate a person means to give the person reasons to feel violated in her self-respect. Self-respect is the kind of respect I owe to myself on the basis of being human. So he would say one way of humiliating a person is treating the person as if she was an object, a chair, and that's why the example of spitting on a person, you treat the person as if she was an object. You can spit on the lawn in front of your house because it's an object, and normally the lawn wouldn't mind, but you cannot do that with a person. Similarly with infantilization. To treat a person as if she was not a full member of the human family is humiliating. And if you reduce a person's agency or the perception of her agency, there is this aspect of infantilization in this very treatment. So I think I just organize it for myself because it shows some nuances, but you are perfectly right to say, isn't that all a case of non-humiliation? And I agree with you on that. The third question, self-violation of dignity with consent. So we had this case, you know, that the famous case in literature is voluntary slavery. We had a case in Germany about cannibalism. And I don't know when it reached, all the way to Puebla. There was a man who wanted to taste human flesh, and he advertised, is there a volunteer who allows me to eat him or her? And there was a terminally ill person who said, well, I have nothing to lose, and that sounds like whatever, interesting experience, and volunteered to be victim to cannibalism. And Germany obviously had a hard time negotiating that because there are no laws against cannibalism because it's normally not, it doesn't happen. My position on that would be similar to the European Court of Human Rights position vis-à-vis Wackenheim. And my position is this. We all are not only individuals, but also ambassadors of humanity. We are also embodiments of humanity. And the concept and category of human dignity is so important that you would not want to leave it to weird individuals, perverts, people who may have very strange tastes or preferences. And there were decisions in the European Court of Human Rights about sadomasochistic practices. And there are limits. There are limits to what consenting adults can justify as in compliance with human dignity. So I would say, when I ask my students, where are you on the Wackenheim case? Most classes are divided 50% versus 50%. And 50% would say, well, Manuel Wackenheim needs to define when his dignity is violated. And the other class would say, well, it's for the courts to define that because it's of general interest. And so my position here would be, I would not want to allow individuals, if the court has a say, to self-violate dignity with consent, because it would set a very dangerous precedent. it is a concept that is of political, cultural, and social importance, the definition and interpretation of which should be a communal and collective exercise. So I would not want to leave it to individuals. That's just my position. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much, Professor. Just a quick, just to follow this last answer, would you say that sometimes dignity overrides bodily autonomy?
So that's part of the larger question of how do autonomy and dignity intersect and interact. I mentioned Ruth Macklin. I didn't mention her by name, but she's famous for her position. As long as we have a sound concept of autonomy, we do not need a special concept of human dignity. And I mentioned I disagree with that because autonomy is sometimes doing work that, human dignity is a concept that does work that human autonomy cannot do. I was once involved in a project comparing the capability approach that emphasizes freedom, agency, autonomy with Catholic social teaching that emphasizes responsibility, dignity, and something less agent pronounced. And I talked about intellectual comfort zones. Representatives of the capability approach feel most comfortable in contexts where you have autonomous agents. Catholic social teaching is also comfortable in contexts where you have a patient, suffering from dementia, where you have a little baby, where you have a comatose patient. And I think human dignity comes in when autonomy is not the most important value in a situation. If you have a patient in a coma, this is still a human person. This is still an addressee of the European Convention of Human Rights, still deserves to be treated with dignity, but there is no autonomy in the person. There is no agency in the person. The person does not have decision latitude. And this is where human dignity as an important aspect comes in. There's an interesting book on humiliation, where Ralf Stöcker, one of the co-editors, discusses a case in Germany from 1994. A young man by the name of Jochen Temsch worked as a civil servant, clearly not up to the job. He was 19 years old, in an ambulant dementia care unit. So they would go to dementia patients and then would help them clean up and cook and then leave the house. And he went to a particularly aggressive dementia patient who was, not himself, not knowing what he did. And young Jochen Temsch really took offense and said, now I want to retaliate. And this retaliation was the following. It was standard practice in that situation to have two washcloths, one for the upper part of the body, for your face, and one for the lower part of your body, for your behind and your genitals. And Jochen Temsch said he would use the washcloth for the lower part of the body for the face of the dementia patient. And Ralf Stöcker discusses, is this a violation of the dignity? Because this is not something that you can justify with an autonomy violation. This probably did not harm the dementia patient, but it was clearly a violation of the dignity and a sign of disrespect on a more symbolic level. So I would think that there can be a sense of you want to uphold a person's dignity, even though autonomy is not the highest value. When we discuss restraining measures in a nursing home, we would say in order to avoid that a person self-harms himself or becomes a danger to others, which also means he could undermine his own dignity by self-mutilation, or he could undermine the dignity of other patients by mutilating them, you have to justify, or you can justify the restraining measure. So in the name of human dignity, you can sometimes justify limits to bodily autonomy, but the more intrusive the measure, the longer the measure, and the more institutionalized the measure, the better the justification has to be. That's my stance on that.
Thank you.
Perhaps some time left for another question. Please.
Thank you. Thank you for your exposition. What do you expect from the next future about the judgment about the violations to human dignity before artificial intelligence, when this is also assumed as a possible human subject for some?
This is a very good question, and it would take a better person than me to answer that, because honestly, I'm not interested in artificial intelligence, and I'm ashamed of that. Don't get me wrong, I'm embarrassed. I know it's very, very important. It's one of the focal areas of our university in the future. I just cannot bring myself to show interest in artificial intelligence. What I do know is the following. There are mainly two discourses here when it comes to human dignity. One discourse is thinking about dignity and rights with, let's say, robots and entities with artificial intelligence. And there is an interesting discourse, I mean, I'm not interested in that, but it is interesting, objectively speaking, on the rights of robots, on the dignity of robots and what does that mean. The other discourse is how can we protect human dignity and human rights vis-a-vis artificial non-human intelligence, non-human dignity and non-human rights. And so far, the main argument I see is that part of human dignity is the special situation or position of the human person. And it will be interesting to see in the future whether this special position can be defended. We know that there is a connection between the human being's special status in the universe and the discourse on human dignity. So when Cicero talked about human dignity, he talked about the dignity of a being with a special place in the universe thanks to reason. When Pico della Mirandola talked about human dignity, he talked about the dignity of a specific being that is not bound by instincts and has to carve out his or her own niche in the universe and the cosmic order. So there's a strong connection between what's special about the human person and what is human dignity. This discourse will come under increasing pressure in the future when the achievements of artificial intelligence become more and more impressive. However, I would also like to say the following. One of my favorite philosophers in the United States is Eva Feder-Kitai. Eva Feder-Kitai is now in her late 70s, and she is the mother of a now more than 50-year-old woman by the name of Sasha. Sasha is severely disabled and has no measurable IQ. And Eva Feder-Kitai wrote a beautiful book with Oxford University Press, Learning from My Daughter. And in this book she says, we all know the philosophical discourse about the human person and the dignity of the human person based on certain properties. And philosophers come up with lists of properties such as reason and conscience and the ability to exercise agency and choices. My daughter does not qualify for these boxes. Nonetheless, every person who encounters my daughter Sasha will immediately know and recognize that she is a human being and that the term dignity, human dignity, is relevant for her, or is one way to think about her. And so that makes me think about whatever artificial intelligence may be in the future. What is human about the human being, about the human person, and what does that mean for our understanding of dignity as we move forward? I'm very careful in connecting the concept of human dignity to achievements. I'm very careful for that, to that, because we have seen, and again, as an Austrian, with the Nazi past of Austria, we are very sensitive to that. We have seen what happens if dignity is based on certain external properties. And so I would hope that we can uphold the idea of human dignity, irrespective of achievements of artificial intelligence, which is not to say that we shouldn't have a discourse on, let's say, rights, responsibilities in the field of AI. but it should not take away from our understanding of human dignity as human dignity. What I'm interested to see as well in the future, since you asked about the future, is where will the ecological discourse take us? Will we in the future talk about the dignity of rivers, the dignity of mountains, the dignity of natural treasures like oceans and lakes? And I'm really not opposed to that. Pope Francis, sadly, we have to say the late Pope Francis in Laudato Si, his encyclical from 2015, talked about the intrinsic dignity of the world, which is a really interesting way of thinking about dignity in non-human terms. So I'm also interested in what will happen to the future of the dignity discourse looking at ecology. That's what I can say about your question, but I apologize, I'm not the best person to answer that very good question.
Thank you very much.
We have some time left. There's someone else.
You can have an extra break. That's also good.
Clemens, first of all, thank you very much for being here and thank you for accepting the invitation. It's a big honor to have you at least by Zoom. Maybe next time we can schedule with a little bit more time. So
thank you. May I just say I love UPAEP, as you all know. I love Puebla. I'm so sorry that I cannot be there. It was really an honor to receive the invitation. And I would really hope that we can see each other very soon in person, either here in Notre Dame or in Puebla. Thank you so much.